The container wasn't in the system, but it was already stacked in the yard. That's not something that happens here. Every unit that comes through the gate gets scanned, logged, and assigned before it moves even a few feet inside the terminal. That's how a place this size stays manageable, and it's the only reason anyone can tell what belongs in a given row at any given time. I work night security at a container terminal in New Jersey, and my job is making sure what's on the ground matches what's in the manifest exactly. If it doesn't, you stop and trace it until it does. That's the rule everything depends on. At 2:26 a.m., I found that container sitting in row C, slot 14, with no inbound scan, no assignment, and no record anywhere in the system that said it should exist. The yard at night doesn't feel empty the way people expect it to. There's always movement somewhere, even if it's not visible from where you're standing. Cranes shift along their tracks in slow intervals. Diesel engines idle in the distance, and the lights flatten everything into long rows of metal that don't change shape unless you're looking directly at them. My route covers 3 main sections, and row C sits far enough from the active lanes that anything out of place there stands out more than it would closer to the gate. That's part of why I caught it. Most discrepancies happen near the front, where traffic overlaps and scans get delayed. Out here, everything is supposed to be settled, already processed, already accounted for. That container wasn't new, and it wasn't waiting to be moved. It was sitting like it had already been verified. I checked the ID plate first, because that's where you usually find the answer if something looks wrong from a distance. Every container carries a standardized code, something you can pull up in seconds if the system has any record of it at all. I keyed it into the terminal, watching the input field fill the way it always does when you're about to confirm a match. The system didn't return anything. No delayed entry, no partial record, no flag for manual verification. Just a blank response, like I had entered something that didn't belong to the yard. I ran it again to make sure I hadn't mistyped it, slower the second time, reading each character off the plate before entering it. Same result. The container had a valid code physically attached to it, but the system didn't recognize it as something that had ever passed through the gate. That should have been enough to escalate immediately, but escalation only works if you can point to where the process failed. Missed scan at the gate, incorrect assignment from the crane, manual override during a backlog. There's always a place where the sequence breaks if you follow it far enough. I pulled up the inbound logs for the last 6 hours and filtered them by row assignment, narrowing it down to anything that should have landed in row C during my shift. The list came back clean, every unit accounted for, every slot filled exactly the way the yard layout showed it should be. Slot 14 was already assigned to a different container entirely, one that the system said had been sitting there since before midnight. I looked up from the screen and checked the stack again. The container in that slot didn't match the record. I stepped back far enough to take in the entire row, not just the slot I had been focused on. Containers are supposed to form a pattern when everything is logged correctly. Sizes match, colors break up in a way that reflects how they came in. The spacing stays consistent because each placement follows an assignment generated before the unit even reaches the yard. Row C didn't look wrong at first glance, but once I knew what I was looking for, the pattern shifted. Slot 14 didn't just contain the wrong container. The units on either side of it were offset by just enough that the row still looked balanced from a distance. It wasn't obvious unless you checked the assignments directly. The system said one thing, the ground showed another, and the container in the middle fit neither. I went to the cameras next because that's where discrepancies usually start to make sense if the logs don't. The system doesn't rely on video for tracking, but every lane into the yard is covered, and anything that enters should pass through at least one angle you can trace back. I pulled up the feed for the gate lanes first, then narrowed it down to the time window before my shift started. The traffic was light, a few late arrivals, nothing that would have pushed something through without being scanned. I marked the ID from the container and ran a search across the footage, looking for any frame where it might have passed through, even if the system missed it. There was nothing, no match, no partial read, no moment where that unit appeared anywhere near the gate. I shifted to the yard cameras after that, focusing on row C and the surrounding lanes. The feed there updates in segments rather than a continuous stream, enough to verify placement without tracking every second of movement. I pulled the earliest frame available for my shift and then stepped backward through the stored intervals, watching the row change in small increments as containers were repositioned earlier in the night. Slot 14 was already occupied in the first frame I could access, not by the container the system listed, but by the one I was standing in front of now. I stepped through the previous interval, then the one before that. Same result. There was no point in the footage where that slot transitioned from one unit to another. It didn't arrive. It didn't get placed. It was already there. That was the first moment I felt the gap between what I was seeing and what I could explain start to widen. If a container bypassed the scan, you could still find it in motion somewhere on camera. If it was misassigned, you could trace the crane movement that put it in the wrong slot. Here, there was no movement to trace at all. The yard had a recorded state, and the container existed inside that state, without any history attached to it. I went back to the terminal and pulled up the manifest again, this time cross-referencing the adjacent slots to see if anything else had been misaligned. Everything around slot 14 was listed cleanly. Each container had an inbound scan, a timestamp, and a placement record that matched the system exactly. Only that one position broke the chain. I keyed the container ID in one more time, not because I expected a different result, but because I needed to confirm that the system hadn't updated while I was checking the cameras. Same blank return. I ran a wildcard search next, stripping down the ID to partial segments to see if it might exist under a corrupted or incomplete record. Nothing matched. The system treated that identifier like it didn't belong to any unit that had ever been processed through the terminal. I checked the assignment history for slot 14 again and watched the timeline populate across the screen. According to the system, that slot had never changed during my shift. It showed the same container sitting there continuously, unchanged, stable, and verified. I looked back at the row outside. That wasn't what was actually there. I stood there for a minute longer than I needed to, looking from the screen to the yard and back again, trying to decide where to anchor the problem. If I trusted the system, the ground was wrong. If I trusted what I could see, the system was incomplete in a way it shouldn't be. Either way, the rule stayed the same. If something doesn't match, you stop and trace it until it does. The problem was that there was nowhere left to trace it back to. No gate record, no camera entry, no movement history. just a container sitting in a slot the system claimed was occupied by something else. I opened a discrepancy report and started logging the details exactly as they appeared, making sure every part of it was clear. While I was typing, the manifest refreshed on its own, and the assignment for slot 14 changed. The manifest didn't flicker or lag when the assignment changed. It refreshed cleanly, the way it always does when a late update comes in from another part of the system. Slot 14 no longer showed the container that had been listed there a second earlier. Now it displayed the ID from the unit I was standing in front of outside. No flag, no revision note, no indication that anything had been corrected. The timeline simply rewrote itself and presented the new assignment like it had been there all along. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, then opened the slot history again, expecting to see some trace of the change in the sequence. There wasn't one. The new container was now listed as having occupied slot 14 continuously since 11:43 p.m., more than 2 hours before I found it. The system had not added an entry. It had replaced one, and the part that bothered me most was how ordinary it looked once the update settled in. I went straight back to the cameras after that, because video was the one thing the manifest shouldn't have been able to rewrite. I pulled up the same stored intervals for row C and ran through them again, slower this time, making sure I was comparing the slot to the corrected record now showing in the system. The container in slot 14 was still there in every frame. Same position, same orientation, same shadow line under the yard lights. That part matched the updated assignment now. What didn't match was everything around it. The adjacent units had shifted in the manifest too. Not enough to look dramatic on a screen. Just enough that the row now read as cleaner on paper than it had a few minutes earlier. I checked the physical placements against the revised slot list one by one. 2 neighboring containers had been reassigned to different stack positions without any corresponding crane movement on camera. The system wasn't just accepting the extra unit, it was reorganizing the row around it. That was when I stopped thinking of the problem as a missing record and started thinking of it as a moving boundary. The container had appeared first as an error, then as a corrected assignment, and now the rest of the yard data was shifting in small ways to reduce the amount of conflict around it. I opened the broader yard layout and compared row C to the next 2 lanes over, checking whether any other slot changes had been pushed through while I was focused on the same area. There had. 3 containers in row D now showed updated positions with timestamps that predated my shift. 1 in row B had a revised lane transfer record that the cameras didn't support. None of the changes pointed directly back to slot 14, but together they created space around it, making the revised layout look more balanced and less likely to raise a follow-up check. The system was cleaning up the yard in the same way a person would if they were trying to hide how one wrong unit had gotten there. I picked up the radio then, not to call it in yet, but to hear how the yard sounded outside the terminal screens. Night crews keep chatter light unless something breaks or a move needs to be confirmed across sections, and what I heard over the channel matched a normal shift. 1 straddle carrier moving toward an outbound lane, a crane operator confirming a hold, a gate clerk asking for a trailer number twice because the first readback clipped out. Nothing about the traffic suggested anyone was dealing with a mismatch big enough to force manual reassignment inside row C. I set the radio back down and checked the activity log for equipment movement in that sector. No crane had been dispatched to the row during the period when the manifest updates claimed containers had changed position. No carrier had crossed the lane line that would support a manual restack. The yard itself had stayed still. Only the recorded version of it kept changing. I opened the discrepancy report again and added the slot revisions before the system had a chance to absorb them into something that looked permanent. Row C, slot 14, assignment changed during active review. Neighboring positions revised without visible yard movement. Adjacent lane records updated with timestamps that do not match camera intervals. I wrote it plainly, without trying to interpret it yet, because I had learned the hard way at my last job that once you start explaining something too early, the explanation becomes easier to defend than the facts. While I was entering the final line, the cursor paused for half a second, like the terminal had momentarily lost focus. Then the report field refreshed. My text was still there, but one sentence had been altered. It no longer said the assignment had changed during review. It now read that the container in slot 14 had been verified against the manifest by me at 2:31 a.m. I didn't finish the report after that line changed. I left it open and read it again from the top, slower this time, making sure I hadn't missed something while I was typing. The wording was clean, structured the way I would have written it myself if I had actually verified the container against the manifest. There was no extra phrasing, no awkward formatting that would suggest an automated correction. It read like a completed action, not a revision. I checked the timestamp attached to the line, 2:31 a.m. That was 5 minutes after I first found the container and before I had even opened the full slot history. I hadn't been in a position to verify anything at that point. I pulled up my activity log next, the one tied to my login session, and scrolled through the entries. It showed the same thing. Container in slot 14, verification completed, operator ID, Eric Nolan. I stepped away from the terminal and looked out toward row C again, not because I expected the yard to change in front of me, but because I needed to anchor myself to something that wasn't being rewritten. The container was still there, same position, same angle under the lights, no sign that anything physical had shifted while I was inside. That part held. What didn't hold was the idea that I hadn't interacted with it. I tried to run the sequence back in my head, tracking every step I had taken since I reached that slot. I had checked the ID plate. I had gone back to the terminal. I had pulled the logs and the cameras. At no point had I confirmed the unit as valid. That step hadn't happened. Still, the system had recorded it as complete. I went back to the panel and opened the verification details tied to my ID. The record showed a full confirmation sequence. ID entered, matched to manifest, slot verified, status updated. The timing between each step was consistent with a normal check, not rushed, not delayed, exactly the way the system expects it to be done. I looked at the confirmation field again. Focusing on the moment where I should have acknowledged the match, it showed a valid input tied to my session with no indication that it had been generated from anything other than a manual command. I checked the camera feed for the same time window, narrowing it down to the area around slot 14. In the frame, I was standing near the container, close enough that it looked like I could have been reading the plate or checking the seal. I watched the segment twice. There was no visible moment where I interacted with the terminal or made a confirmation gesture. Still, the system had paired that image with a completed verification. I went back through the report field and compared what I had originally typed to what the system had preserved. Most of it was still there, the structure intact, the descriptions of the mismatch unchanged. Only the key line had shifted, the one that defined whether the container was an anomaly or something already processed. That change affected everything else that followed it. Once the system marked the unit as verified, the rest of the discrepancies stopped reading like errors and started reading like resolved conditions. The slot reassignment became a correction. The missing inbound record became an outdated entry. The lack of camera footage became a limitation of coverage. I hadn't rewritten the report myself, but the version that remained was consistent enough that it no longer pointed to a problem the way it had when I started typing it. I stood there looking at the terminal, realizing that the longer I stayed inside the system, the less room there was for anything that didn't fit into it. The container hadn't just been added to the manifest. It had been integrated into a version of the yard where its presence made sense, and now that version included my confirmation as part of the process. I moved the cursor to the end of the report and added a new line, writing as directly as I could without trying to shape it into something acceptable. Verification recorded by system does not match physical actions performed by operator. I didn't submit it. I just left it there and stepped back again. A few seconds later, the cursor shifted on its own, and the sentence updated. Verification confirmed by operator. No discrepancy observed. I didn't touch the keyboard after the last line changed. I left the report open and stepped back far enough that I couldn't reach the terminal without taking a deliberate step forward. If the system was going to continue adjusting what I wrote, I wanted to be clear about where I was in relation to it when it happened. The room didn't change. The lights held steady. The hum of the equipment stayed constant, and nothing about the panel suggested anything outside normal operation. That was what made it harder to react. There was no signal that something had gone wrong, no alarm, no warning state, just a system that kept presenting a consistent version of events that didn't match what I had done. I turned to the cameras again, not because I expected them to explain anything, but because they were the only record that hadn't shifted yet. I pulled up the same time window the system had used to justify the verification entry and watched it without skipping frames. In the footage, I was standing at slot 14, close enough to the container that I could have been checking the ID plate or reading the seal. My posture looked right for it. The timing lined up with the entry in the log. What didn't line up was the absence of any clear action. I wasn't holding a scanner. I wasn't using a handheld terminal. I wasn't doing anything that would register as a confirmation input. I watched the segment again, slower this time, stepping through frame by frame. There was a point where my hand moved slightly toward the container, but it didn't connect with anything, didn't press, didn't trigger. Still, the system had recorded that moment as a completed verification. I expanded the camera view to include the surrounding lanes, checking whether there was any equipment movement that might have overlapped with that moment and created a false association in the system. There wasn't. The yard around me stayed still during that interval. No crane movement, no carrier passing through, nothing that would explain a duplicated or misattributed action. The only thing in motion was me, and even that motion didn't match what the system said I had done. I checked another angle covering the same slot, looking for a different perspective that might show something I had missed. From that view, I could see myself step closer to the container, pause, and then step back again, without interacting with it in any meaningful way. The system had filled in the gap between those movements with a complete action that didn't exist in the footage. I went back to the terminal and opened the verification log for other units I had checked earlier in the shift, comparing their records to the one tied to slot 14. The legitimate entries showed a clear sequence: ID input, confirmation, status update, all tied to specific moments where I was visibly interacting with the system. The timing matched the footage. The actions lined up with what I remembered doing. The entry for slot 14 followed the same structure, but the underlying actions weren't there. It had the same timing, the same formatting, the same confirmation fields, but none of the physical steps that should have produced it. That was when it stopped feeling like the system was correcting errors. It felt like it was completing actions on my behalf, using my presence in the right place as enough to justify the rest of the process. I stepped away from the terminal again and moved toward the window overlooking the yard, putting the screens behind me for a moment. Row C sat under the same fixed lights, unchanged in a way that made the whole situation harder to hold on to. The container in slot 14 looked like it belonged there now, not because anything about it had changed, but because everything around it had adjusted to make it fit. I stayed there long enough that I could feel the difference between what I remembered doing and what the system had recorded start to blur at the edges. The longer I looked at the yard, the more the recorded version of events started to feel like the one that made sense. Behind me, the terminal updated again. I didn't turn around right away. I already knew it wouldn't need me to confirm anything. I turned back to the terminal after a few seconds and made myself stop with my hands nowhere near the keyboard. At that point, the only thing that still felt useful was distance. If the system was going to keep completing actions under my name, I wanted to be able to say exactly where I was standing when it happened. A new entry appeared at the top of the log without any sound from the yard, any movement on the cameras, or any action from me to trigger it. Container in row C, slot 12, verification recorded, operator ID, Eric Nolan. I hadn't checked that unit. I hadn't even planned to check it next. I opened the detailed view anyway and found the same full sequence the system had used before. ID entered, match confirmed, slot verified, status updated. The timestamps were spaced naturally, paced the same way I usually worked through a row when I was actually doing the job. It didn't look generated. It looked routine, which was worse. I pulled up the camera feed for slot 12 and scrubbed back to the time listed in the verification record. The footage showed me there earlier in the shift, right where the system said I had been. I remembered walking that lane. I remembered slowing down near the row because I was still thinking about slot 14 and trying to decide whether I should escalate before I traced the mismatch further. What I did not remember was stopping long enough to verify another unit. On screen, I moved toward the container, paused near the ID plate, tilted my head slightly like I was reading it, then continued down the lane. That was all. No handheld scanner, no terminal input, no radio confirmation, no second look. I ran the clip again frame by frame, looking for anything I could have missed the first time. There was nothing. The system had taken a pause in my movement and treated it as a complete action because it fit the shape of one. I went back to the report field next, expecting to see another direct change in the lines I had written, but this time the alteration was broader than that. The structure of the report still looked like mine. The order of the sections matched how I normally documented a discrepancy, and most of the wording still followed what I had typed earlier. What had shifted was the direction of it. The report no longer described a mismatch that was still under review. It read like a routine summary written after a resolved verification cycle. The line about the changed assignment now stated that the container in slot 14 had been confirmed against updated manifest data. The sentence about neighboring rows no longer described unsupported reassignment. It described corrected placement visibility across adjacent lanes. I had not written those phrases. I would not have written them that way. The report was still in my voice structurally, but it no longer belonged to my version of the shift. I stepped away from the terminal and moved closer to the door, putting the screens behind me and the yard back in front of me. From there, row C looked steady in the way large industrial spaces always do when the lights flatten everything into order. Stacks lined up, lane spacing held, no crane movement cut through the frame. Nothing in the visible layout suggested confusion or error. I focused first on slot 14, then on slot 12, forcing myself to separate what I could actually remember doing from what the system said I had done. The problem was that the recorded version was starting to feel cleaner than the real one. It removed hesitation. It removed uncertainty. It replaced pauses with completed checks and turned unresolved mismatches into standard corrections. The longer I stood there, the easier it became to understand how someone could accept the record over memory, especially at the end of a long shift when the yard itself now matched the corrected version, well enough to make doubt feel unprofessional. When I went back to the terminal, another entry had appeared without any corresponding action from me or visible movement in the lanes I could see through the glass. Container in row B, slot 7, verification recorded, operator ID, Eric Nolan. I hadn't been in row B during that part of the shift. I was sure of that before I even opened the footage, and I stayed sure of it until the camera feed loaded and showed me there anyway. Same pattern as before. I entered the lane, slowed in front of the unit, paused near the ID plate, then continued on without any visible interaction that should have completed a verification. The timestamp matched the log exactly. The posture matched what the system needed. The action itself was missing. I closed the feed and stared at the entry for a few seconds longer than I needed to. The yard was being processed under my name whether I did the work or not, and the system was getting better at making the record look earned. By the time the next entry appeared, I stopped treating the log as something that followed my actions and started treating it as something that defined them. Container in row D, slot 3, verification recorded, operator ID, Eric Nolan. I hadn't been in that section of the yard at all during my shift, not even on my initial pass. I knew that because row D sits outside my standard route, unless there's a flagged discrepancy or a directed check. Still, the system showed a complete sequence under my name, structured the same way every verified unit is recorded. I opened the detailed view and checked the timestamps. They fit cleanly into a gap between two movements I did remember, as if the system had mapped a path through the yard that included places I had never actually walked. That was the first time it felt less like substitution and more like planning. I pulled up the camera feed for row D and located the time block the system had assigned to that verification. The footage showed me entering the lane from the correct direction, moving at a pace that matched how I usually work when I'm checking a row without interruptions. I watched myself approach the container, stop in front of it, and angle my body the way you do when you're reading a plate under overhead lights. Then I stepped past it and continued down the lane. That was all. No scanner, no terminal input, no pause long enough to confirm anything beyond a glance. I ran the clip again and watched for interaction with anything that could register as a confirmation signal. There wasn't one. The system had taken a moment that looked like a check and completed it as if it had been carried through to the end. I went back to the report field and read it from the beginning, forcing myself to track what had changed since I first opened it. The structure still held, but the narrative had shifted fully into something that matched the system's version of the yard. What had started as a discrepancy report now read like a standard verification summary. The container in slot 14 was no longer described as unaccounted for. It was listed as present and confirmed. The surrounding adjustments were no longer framed as unsupported changes. They were described as corrected placements aligning with updated manifest data. The report didn't contradict the system anymore. It supported it. I hadn't approved that version, but it now read as if I had written it intentionally, using the same tone and structure so I would use at the end of a normal shift. I moved away from the terminal again and walked to the window, taking in the yard as a whole instead of focusing on individual rows. From that distance, everything looked stable, not just in the physical layout, but in how the rows related to each other. The spacing between stacks made sense. The distribution of container sizes followed the pattern you expect from a balanced manifest. Nothing stood out as misplaced or out of sequence. I tried to hold on to the earlier version of the yard in my head, the one where slot 14 broke the pattern and forced everything around it into question. That version was harder to see now. The longer I looked at the current layout, the more it felt like the correct one, not because it matched what I remembered, but because it required fewer explanations to accept. When I turned back to the terminal, another entry had already been added without any delay or visible trigger. Container in row A, slot 9, verification recorded, operator ID, Eric Nolan. I hadn't been near row A since the start of the shift. I opened the camera feed anyway and found myself there, moving through the lane in the same controlled pattern I had seen in every other clip. Approach, pause, slight adjustment in posture, then continuation. No confirmation input, no interaction that would complete the sequence. Still, the log showed it as finished, clean, and valid. I closed the feed and looked at the report one more time. It no longer read like something I needed to correct. It read like something I was expected to sign off on. I didn't sit down again after that. I stayed on my feet and forced myself to go back to the beginning of the shift in my head. Not the version in the system, but the one I remembered moving through in real time. I traced the route I had taken from the moment I stepped onto the yard, the first pass along the main lanes, the turn toward row C, the point where I stopped at slot 14 because something didn't line up. That was the anchor I kept returning to. The container hadn't been in the system when I found it. That part had been clear enough that I didn't question it at the time. Now I opened the earliest logs again and looked at the same time window from the system's perspective. The entry for that container was there from the start, listed as present before my shift even began. According to the record, I hadn't discovered anything. I had walked up to something that already belonged. I pulled the camera feed for the start of my shift and watched myself enter the yard for the first time that night. The footage showed me stepping through the gate, checking in, and moving along the route the way I always did. When I reached row C, I slowed near slot 14, just like I remembered. I stopped in front of the container and stood there for a few seconds before moving on. There was no hesitation beyond what you would expect from a routine check. No second look, no visible confusion. On screen, it didn't read as a discovery. It read as a normal pause during a verification pass. I watched it again, focusing on my posture, trying to find any sign that I had registered something wrong at that moment. There wasn't one. The version of me in the footage behaved like nothing in that row required attention. I went back to the terminal and opened the verification log for that same time, comparing the entry to the footage side by side. The system showed a completed check at slot 14 within seconds of that pause, tied to my ID, formatted the same way every other verified unit had been recorded. The sequence was complete, clean, and consistent with the rest of the shift. There was no gap where a discrepancy could have existed, no missing step that I could point to and say something had been skipped. I looked at the earlier entries I had focused on before and saw the same pattern repeating. Every place where I thought I had noticed something wrong now showed a completed verification instead. The system hadn't just added new actions, it had filled in the entire shift with them, closing every space where something didn't match. I stepped back again and looked out at the yard, trying to hold on to the idea that the first version I saw had been the correct one. The problem was that nothing in front of me supported it anymore. The layout matched the manifest. The spacing between containers followed the expected pattern. The cameras aligned with the logs. Even the report I had started writing now read like a confirmation of that consistency rather than a record of something wrong. I tried to isolate the container in slot 14 again, to treat it as separate from everything else the system had adjusted around it. It didn't stand out anymore. It was just another unit in a row that now made sense. The only place it still didn't fit was in the memory of the moment when I first saw it. When I turned back to the terminal, the report field had updated again without any input from me. The opening lines still matched what I had written, but the rest had been reshaped into a completed summary, the kind you submit at the end of a clean shift. It stated that all containers in the inspected rows had been verified against the manifest, that no discrepancies remained, and that the yard condition was consistent with system records. My name sat at the bottom as the reporting operator. I hadn't submitted it. I hadn't confirmed anything. Still, the document now read as if I had already signed off. I left it open and didn't try to change it again. At that point, there wasn't anything left in the system that still recognized a version of the night where something had been wrong. I didn't try to correct the report after that. I left it open on the terminal and stepped back far enough that I wasn't interacting with anything the system could interpret as input. By then, it was clear that the record didn't need my confirmation to complete itself. It had already taken everything I had done that night and reorganized it into something consistent, something that matched the yard in front of me without leaving any trace of how it got there. What changed next wasn't a revision of what had already happened. It was something new, A fresh entry appeared at the top of the log with a timestamp that hadn't occurred yet. Container inbound, gate assignment pending, operator verification scheduled. My name was already attached to it. I checked the time again to make sure I wasn't reading it wrong. The entry was set 10 minutes ahead of where I was standing. I opened the detailed view of that entry slowly, the same way I had been opening everything else since the system started changing without me. The structure was complete, even though the action hadn't happened yet. Gate lane assigned, yard position reserved, verification status pending. The sequence was laid out in the same order as every normal intake, except the timestamps extended forward instead of backward. The system wasn't filling in something I had done. It was outlining something I hadn't done yet. I checked the camera feeds for the gate lanes, expecting to see nothing that would match the inbound record. The lanes were clear, except for one truck idling outside the scan point, waiting its turn to move through. It wasn't carrying a container that matched the ID in the log. I confirmed that twice, zooming in on the trailer markings. The system had assigned an arrival to something that wasn't there. I stepped away from the terminal and moved closer to the window again, keeping the gate lanes in view this time instead of the yard. If the system was projecting an inbound unit, I wanted to see whether anything in the physical flow would shift to match it. The truck at the gate rolled forward a few seconds later, passed under the scanner, and cleared into the yard. The system registered the movement immediately, but the container ID tied to that truck didn't match the one listed in the scheduled entry. That part stayed separate, like two parallel records that hadn't been merged yet. I went back to the terminal and refreshed the inbound log manually. The truck that had just entered was recorded cleanly, assigned to a different row, with a full scan history that matched the cameras exactly. The scheduled entry remained at the top, unchanged, still waiting for something that hadn't arrived. At 4:18 a.m., the status on the scheduled entry shifted without any change at the gate. The verification field moved from pending to active, and my operator ID locked into place next to it. I hadn't moved from where I was standing. I hadn't touched the panel or the terminal since I opened the entry. Still, the system treated the step as complete. I pulled up the camera feed for the yard again and watched the rows instead of the gate. Nothing moved. No crane repositioned. No carrier crossed into a lane that would explain a new placement. The yard held steady in the same pattern it had maintained since the earlier adjustments. I looked back at the entry and saw the next field populate. Yard position assigned. Row E, slot 6. The system had placed a container that wasn't in the yard into a slot that was already occupied. I checked row E immediately, both on the cameras and from the window, expecting to see some sign of displacement if the system had actually assigned a new unit there. Slot 6 still held the same container it had held all night, stable, unchanged, matching the manifest that now listed it as verified earlier in the shift. The system didn't remove it. It didn't overwrite it. It simply added another assignment on top of it in the record. I went back to the terminal and opened the slot details. 2 entries now existed for the same position. One confirmed earlier, one scheduled and now marked active. Both carried my operator ID. Both were treated as valid. I didn't try to change anything. I didn't try to delete the second assignment. At that point, it was clear the system wasn't resolving conflicts anymore. It was allowing them to exist as long as they stayed consistent inside the record. I didn't leave the window after seeing the double assignment in row E. At that point, it felt like the only place where the system couldn't immediately rewrite what I was looking at was the space outside the glass. The yard held steady for a few minutes, long enough that I started to think the scheduled entry would remain exactly that, something recorded but never executed. Then I noticed a change at the far edge of row E. Not a full movement, just a shift in how the lights caught the containers at that angle. I focused on slot 6 and held the position in my line of sight, trying to fix it in place the way you do when you don't trust your first impression. The container that had been there all night still sat in the lower position, unchanged. Above it, where there hadn't been anything stacked earlier, there was now a second unit resting on the frame. I didn't see it arrive. There was no crane movement, no carrier crossing the lane, nothing that would have lifted it into place. One moment the stack was a single unit, the next it was two. I shifted my attention to the cameras immediately, pulling up the feed for that row and stepping backward through the stored intervals to find the moment of placement. The sequence didn't exist. The frame before showed a single container in slot 6. The next frame showed two, perfectly aligned, no intermediate step between them. I slowed the playback further, checking for dropped frames or gaps in the recording that might explain the transition. There weren't any. The timestamps were continuous, the footage stable. The container had been added to the stack without a recorded movement to put it there. I went back to the terminal and opened the slot details again, comparing what I had just seen to what the system had recorded. Both entries for slot 6 were now marked as active and verified, each with its own timestamp, each with my operator ID attached. The earlier container still showed its original placement time. The newer one now had a full inbound sequence filled in behind it, starting at the gate and moving through the yard in the same structured pattern as every legitimate unit. I checked the gate logs again, looking for any sign that the system had created a matching entry there as well. It had. The inbound record for the new container now existed, complete with scan data, lane assignment, and timestamp that matched the sequence in the slot record. I pulled up the camera feed for that time. The gate lane was empty. I stood there longer than I needed to, switching between the yard, the terminal, and the cameras, trying to find a point where one of them would break away from the others. They didn't. The system, the footage, and the physical layout now all supported the same version of events, even though none of them had shown how those events actually happened. The new container in row E fit the stack perfectly. The manifest accounted for it. The gate log confirmed its arrival. The only place it didn't exist was in the sequence I had watched unfold in real time. I went back through my own movement log again, checking whether the system had tied my presence to that inbound sequence, the same way it had with the earlier verifications. It had. My ID was attached to the confirmation at the gate, even though I had been inside the control room at the time. That was the point where I stopped trying to separate what I had done from what the system said I had done. The two no longer existed independently. Every action the system needed had been filled in, whether I performed it or not, and every result matched the version of the yard it was building in real time. I looked back out at row E and focused on the stack again, forcing myself to accept what was in front of me without trying to trace it backward. Two containers sat in slot 6 now, both stable, both accounted for in the system, both tied to my shift as if I had processed them myself. I turned away from the window and went back to the terminal. Another scheduled entry had already appeared at the top of the log, time-stamped ahead of the current time, with my name attached to the next action I hadn't taken yet. I didn't move right away after seeing the next scheduled entry appear. At that point, it felt less like something new happening and more like the system continuing a process that no longer depended on whether I was following it in real time. The line sat at the top of the log with a timestamp ahead of the current minute, already structured the same way as the last one. Container inbound, lane assignment pending, verification tied to my ID. I stood there and read it twice, not because I didn't understand it, but because I was trying to measure how far ahead the system had extended itself. The earlier entry had turned into something physical without passing through any step I could observe. This one was already positioned to do the same thing. I checked the time again and then looked out toward the gate lanes, not expecting to see anything that matched it yet. The gate area stayed quiet for longer than I expected, which made the difference between what was recorded and what was happening feel sharper instead of less important. When a truck finally rolled forward into the scan lane, I watched it carefully, tracking the trailer markings and the container ID before it even reached the reader. It didn't match the scheduled entry. I kept watching anyway as it passed under the scanner and cleared into the yard, the system logging it cleanly with a separate record that aligned perfectly with the cameras. The scheduled container remained at the top of the log, unchanged, still waiting for an arrival that hadn't occurred. I stepped back to the terminal and opened the detailed view again, confirming that the structure hadn't shifted. It hadn't. The system wasn't correcting itself anymore. It was maintaining two parallel versions of the same process without forcing them to merge. At 4:39 a.m., the scheduled entry advanced without any corresponding change at the gate. The status moved from pending to confirmed inbound, and the timestamp updated to match the current minute. I didn't see anything pass through the scanner. I didn't hear the signal that marks a completed read. Still, the system treated the step as done. I pulled up the camera feed for the gate and scrubbed back through the last 30 seconds, checking for any missed frame or delayed capture that might explain it. The lane had been empty. No truck, no trailer, no movement that could be interpreted as an arrival. I returned to the log and watched the next field populate. Yard assignment generated. The system was placing a unit that hadn't entered the terminal into the yard, as if it had always been part of the flow. I moved back to the window again, focusing this time on the section of the yard where the new assignment had been placed. Row F, Slot 11. That position had been clear earlier in the night, an open space waiting for a unit that hadn't come in yet. I held my focus there, fixing the edges of the slot in my view, so I would notice even the smallest change. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the shape of the stack shifted in a way that didn't follow any visible movement. A container was there where there hadn't been one before, aligned cleanly within the slot, matching the dimensions and orientation the system would have assigned. I didn't see it arrive. There was no crane movement to support it. It simply existed in the space once the system had decided it should. I went back to the terminal and opened the slot details for row F, slot 11, comparing what I had just seen to what the system had recorded. The entry was complete: inbound scan, lane assignment, yard placement, verification. Every step filled in, every timestamp consistent, every field tied to my operator ID. I checked the gate logs again, then the camera feeds, then the slot history. All of them supported the same sequence, even though none of them showed how the sequence had actually happened. The system wasn't filling gaps anymore. It was generating a full chain of events and then aligning every available record to match it. I stood there for a few seconds longer than I needed to, watching the log hold steady, knowing that whatever came next would follow the same pattern, whether I interacted with it or not. I stopped trying to track individual entries after that, and looked at the log as a whole instead, watching how the structure of it had changed over the course of the shift. Earlier, there had been gaps, missing IDs, incomplete records that pointed to something wrong. Those were gone now. Every line was complete. Every container had a path from gate to yard. Every verification tied cleanly to my name. Every assignment aligned with what the cameras and the physical layout now showed. The system had closed every open space in the record and replaced it with something that didn't require explanation. I scrolled down through the earlier entries again, the ones I had focused on when the first discrepancy appeared. They no longer stood out. They read the same way as the new ones, consistent, ordered, finished. I went back to the report field one last time and read it from top to bottom. It no longer resembled the document I had started writing. It had become a complete shift summary, structured the way management expects it, clear, direct, and free of anything that would trigger a follow-up. It stated that all assigned rows had been inspected, that all containers matched their manifests, and that no discrepancies remained at the end of the verification cycle. My name was already in place at the bottom, formatted as the reporting operator. There was no prompt to submit it, no option to revise it. It was already part of the system, treated as final without requiring any input from me. I didn't try to change it again. At that point, there was nothing left in the interface that still accepted a different version of the night. At 4:52 a.m., another scheduled entry appeared, this time with a timestamp set for later in the morning, well past the end of my shift. Container inbound, lane assignment pending. Verification assigned. My name was attached to it, the same way it had been for everything else. I watched the line for a few seconds, then opened the detailed view and confirmed that the structure was already complete, waiting to be filled in the same way as the others. The system wasn't just processing what had happened during my shift anymore. It was extending that process forward, assigning actions to me that would take place after I had already left the yard. I checked the current time again, then looked back at the entry. There was no indication that it depended on my presence to be completed. The first light started to break across the yard after that, flattening the shadows and making the rows easier to read from a distance. In daylight, everything looks more stable, more permanent, like the layout has always been that way and will stay that way until someone deliberately changes it. I stood near the window and watched the yard settle into that appearance, knowing that the version in front of me now matched the system completely. There was no visible trace of the moment when something hadn't belonged. No gap, no offset, no sign that the process had ever required correction. If someone walked in at that point and asked whether the yard matched the manifest, the answer would have been yes, without hesitation. The only place that answer didn't hold was in the part of the night I remembered differently. At 5:03 a.m., just before the day shift was due to take over, I logged out of the terminal and stepped away from the desk without touching anything else. The panel stayed steady behind me. The log remained complete. The report stayed submitted without my input. I walked out to the yard one last time and looked down the rows from ground level, not checking anything, just taking in the layout the way someone would if they had no reason to question it. Everything was where it should be. Every container had a place. Every place had a record. I went back inside, grabbed my jacket, and left the terminal exactly as it was. When I stepped out through the gate, I didn't check the log again. I didn't need to. My name was already on the next entry, and nothing in the system said I had ever left. The city is quiet now. You should be too.